Hey, it's Michael Dermer here, and in this lesson, we're here to talk about the different types of investments. When you go out to raise money for your company, there's lots of different ways that you can do that, and in this lesson, we're going to walk you through a couple of those. So what do we mean by the different types of investments? There's essentially a couple of different major categories of investments. So first is equity. Equity is essentially when you bring in investment capital into your company, you're doing it in exchange for an ownership interest in the company. Okay, and it can take many, many forms, right? But at its basic level, it's an ownership interest in your company. Now, there's all different types of equity, right? There's what's called preferred stock, in which your investor gets kind of preferred rights in your company. And then there's common stock. Common stock are things where essentially somebody just has a general ownership interest in the company. They're kind of a shareholder, but they don't have preferred rights in your company. And what you'll hear, depending on the stage that you're at, is you'll hear equity investments be called things like seed capital, right? Seed capital is generally that very, very early stage money that just gets you off the ground, right? Where a lot of you may be. But then as you advance and you get more sophisticated, you get into what are called different series of equity investments. So that will be Series A, which is usually your first investment from a sophisticated outside partner like a venture capital company. And then that moves on to more sophisticated investments, Series B, Series C, which tend to be larger when your business is a little bit further along. But essentially what equity is an ownership interest in your company. So the second major category of investment is called debt. And unlike equity, which does not have an obligation to repay that money, right? Debt does have an obligation. When somebody makes an equity investment, they're owning a piece of your company and they're going to realize a return if ultimately the company is sold or if the company makes distributions or dividends. But there is no actual obligation in most cases to repay that money. Debt is different. With respect to normal debt, somebody is making an investment in your company, but they're doing it in exchange for the repayment of that principal of that debt plus interest, right? So that is an obligation of the company to repay that debt, right? Even if the company's not doing well. And so unlike equity, that's an ownership interest, but there's no obligation. Debt has an obligation for you to pay it back. Now, obviously in early stage companies, it's difficult to get debt investments because folks like banks and institutions want to see a track record that you're going to have the ability to pay it back. And that's why a lot of early stage companies go out for equity investments. But there are a couple of different type of debt vehicles that I'll walk you through here. First is a traditional loan. So that's almost, think of it like a mortgage on your house, right? You're going to say you're going to get a loan for 5 years. You're going to pay a certain amount of principal and interest in each month. And that's going to be spread out over the course of the loan. As I mentioned before, those are really difficult to get as an early stage company. But they have other types which are called venture debt. And venture debt is a little bit difficult because it recognizes that companies are at these earlier stages. And so it's structured debt a little bit of a different way. Typically venture debt doesn't have repayments for the first couple of years, right? And venture debt has with it kind of an equity ownership component. In other words, the institution lending the venture debt, they're going to get some what they call warrants or ownership interest in your company in addition to debt. Another form of debt that's a little less formal is called accounts receivable credit lines. Sometimes this is also called factoring, right? And what this basically means is that let's say you have sales to particular customers, but it takes them 30, 60, 90 days to pay you, okay? Those are called accounts receivable. And so what you can do is you can go to these factoring companies, these accounts receivable financing companies, and say, when I ultimately sell something to a customer and I invoice them, you're going to advance me, let's say 80% of that money before I even collect it from my client. Okay? Now they are ultimately, when that money does come in from your client, right, that money is going to be repaid to them, right? And you pay pretty substantial fees for this, right? So essentially what you're doing is advancing how quickly money comes into your company. But in exchange for doing that, you can spend anywhere from 5 to 20% of the amount. Okay, so this is not always your best first option, but sometimes an option early stage companies need to take advantage of. Another type of debt that's out there are SBA loans. So SBA loans are loans from the Small Business Administration that are not any different from any other types of loans to the extent that you have to pay them back and there's a term to them. But they're put out by the SBA, and the SBA has loan guarantee programs in which they guarantee for the banks that you borrow from the repayment of the loan. So all of these different types of vehicles are debt, unlike equity, have that obligation to pay it back. Okay. The third major category is really a hybrid of debt and equity, and it's what they call convertible notes. Okay. So what essentially happens is somebody lends money to the company, so it's a loan, it's debt, and that's in the form of a promissory note. And essentially there's a component of that promissory note that essentially says upon some event, let's say it's the raising of money, it could be 1 year later, that those notes will actually convert into equity. Okay? And this vehicle is actually used a lot by early stage companies because it's very difficult to put a value on a company, right? So for example, if you're going to invest $1 million in a brand new concept, right? How would you know how to value that company? So what convertible notes allow you to do is to say, I'm going to make that investment as a debt investment for $1 million. And then when the first round of financing of equity actually happens, where there's a valuation put on the company by some third party, this debt will convert at that same valuation or at some discount to that valuation. Okay? So convertible notes are this kind of hybrid that are used to kind of get over the fact that it's hard to value early stage companies. And it's also very much quicker to get convertible notes done. The legal agreements are very simple and straightforward. Unlike equity agreements where you have to build in all of these rights and you have to value the company, which is very difficult. Now there's a fourth type of financing that is not really available to everybody, and it's really hard to rely upon these, and that's grants. Government agencies, state agencies, federal agencies often have grant programs. In addition, sometimes charitable foundations have grants available in which they basically give dollars to companies, sometimes only nonprofit, sometimes for-profit, to pursue a particular objective or initiative. So there's lots of companies that have gotten started with grants, although usually it's a pretty complicated process to go through the grant process. There are grant process services and grant writing individuals that can help you with that. And that's just another kind of fourth type of financing that with respect to grants, you have obligations, but generally speaking, it's not an equity interest in your company. You don't have an obligation to repay it. You just have to meet the standards of the individual grants. Okay? So when you really break it down, there's equity, there's debt, there's convertible notes or convertible debt, and grants. And these are really the major types of financing that you can bring into your business. Okay? In addition to this video, there's lots of written information about this particular topic side by side with this video and this lesson.